In the frozen wasteland of Eastern Europe, where death whispers through the wind and every shadow could be your last, 7 of the world's most deadly marksmen gathered for what they believed would be an easy hunt. They were seasoned killers, each with over 50 confirmed kills, armed with the finest rifles money could buy. Their target? A single woman who had made the mistake of crossing their path.
What they didn't know was that they weren't the hunters in this deadly game. They were the prey.
Within 72 hours, 6 of them would be dead, and the 7th would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, haunted by the memory of a ghost who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. This is the true story of Elena Vasquez, a woman who turned the tables on death itself and vanished into legend before her enemies even realized they were already in her crosshairs.
Some say she was trained by the most elite forces in the world. Others claim she learned her deadly skills in the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan.
But the truth is far more extraordinary than any legend. This is her story, a tale of survival, revenge, and the thin line between hunter and hunted that can disappear in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The snow fell in thick sheets across the Romanian countryside, each flake catching the pale morning light like tiny diamonds before settling into the growing drifts that would soon make travel impossible. Elena Vasquez pressed her back against the rough bark of an ancient oak tree, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter cold as she studied the terrain below through her binoculars. The abandoned monastery stretched out before her like a stone fortress, its weathered walls and broken towers telling stories of better times when prayers, not bullets, filled the air.
She had been tracking the arms dealers for 3 weeks, following a trail of blood money and broken lives that stretched from the back alleys of Bucharest to this forgotten corner of the Carpathian Mountains. The men she hunted weren't ordinary criminals.
They were part of an international network that sold weapons to the highest bidder, regardless of how many innocents would die as a result. Elena had seen their handiwork firsthand in a small village near the Serbian border, where an entire school had been destroyed by mortars that bore their signature markings. The memory of those children's faces still burned in her mind as she adjusted her position, careful not to disturb the snow that had accumulated on her white camouflage suit. She had learned patience during her years as a military sniper, serving in conflicts that most people only read about in newspapers.
But this was personal now. Her younger brother Miguel had been investigating the same arms-dealing network as a journalist when he disappeared 6 months ago. The last message she received from him was a single photograph of the monastery below, sent from a burner phone moments before his phone went dark forever. Elena lowered her binoculars and checked her watch.
According to the intelligence she had gathered, the arms dealers were expecting a major shipment today. 7 men would be arriving to oversee the transfer of weapons that would eventually find their way into the hands of terrorists and criminals across Eastern Europe.
She had studied each of their files until she could recite their histories from memory. Viktor Kozlov, the Russian who specialized in surface-to-air missiles. André Beaumont, the Frenchman who preferred dealing in explosives. Hassan al-Rashid, whose network stretched across the Middle East.
Each man was responsible for countless deaths, and each man would pay for what they had done.
The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of engines echoing off the monastery walls. Elena's pulse quickened as she saw the first of the black SUVs emerging from the forest road below.
She counted 7 vehicles in total, each one armored, and carrying men who had survived decades in one of the world's most dangerous professions. These weren't amateurs who would make careless mistakes or leave themselves exposed to enemy fire.
They were professionals who had earned their reputations through years of violence and cunning. As the convoy approached the monastery gates, Elena began her mental countdown.
She had memorized every detail of the ancient building's layout, from the crumbling bell tower that offered perfect overwatch positions to the network of underground tunnels that connected the various buildings. The arms dealers would set up their operation in the main courtyard, where trucks could easily access the storage areas that had once housed religious artifacts but now served as warehouses for instruments of death.
The first man to emerge from the lead vehicle was immediately recognizable from his photograph. Dmitry Volkov stood nearly 7 feet tall, his massive frame made even more imposing by the heavy winter coat that couldn't quite hide the assault rifle strapped across his chest. Elena had read his file so many times she could have written his biography. Former Spetsnaz, dishonorably discharged after being caught selling military secrets. He had since built a reputation as one of the most ruthless enforcers in the arms-dealing business, personally responsible for eliminating at least 30 people who had crossed his organization. Behind Volkov came the others, each one a predator in his own right. Elena watched through her scope as they spread out across the courtyard with the practiced efficiency of men who had survived countless dangerous situations. They moved in patterns that spoke of military training and hard-earned paranoia, never bunching up enough to present easy targets, always keeping escape routes open. constantly scanning for threats. But Elena had something they didn't expect. She had been here for 3 days, moving through the surrounding forest like a ghost, mapping every possible approach and escape route. She knew which floorboards creaked in the abandoned buildings, which walls would stop bullets and which would simply slow them down. Most importantly, she had discovered the secret that the monastery's original builders had hidden within its ancient stones. The tunnel system beneath the complex was far more extensive than any modern blueprint would suggest. Medieval monks had carved passages through the solid rock, creating a hidden network that connected not just the monastery buildings, but extended far out into the surrounding forest. Elena had spent 2 full days exploring these passages, marking her path with small stones, and memorizing every turn. What the arms dealers saw as an isolated fortress was actually a maze with dozens of hidden entrances and exits. As the morning wore on, more vehicles arrived. Elena counted 14 men in total, each one armed with military-grade weapons and moving with the confidence of professionals who believed they had chosen an impregnable location for their business. She recognized several faces from intelligence files, men whose names appeared on international wanted lists, but who had managed to stay one step ahead of law enforcement for years. The arms shipment itself arrived just after noon, carried in 3 unmarked trucks that had clearly traveled a long distance judging by the mud and wear on their tires. Elena watched through her scope as wooden crates were unloaded and stacked in the monastery's main hall. She could see enough to identify several types of weapons, including shoulder-fired missiles that could bring down aircraft and explosive devices powerful enough to level entire city blocks. But Elena wasn't here to steal weapons or gather intelligence. She was here for justice, and justice meant that none of these men would leave the monastery alive. The challenge was that she was outnumbered 14 to 1, facing opponents who were all trained killers with decades of combat experience. In a straight fight, she would have no chance of survival. Fortunately, Elena had no intention of fighting fair.
As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, she made her first move. The monastery's bell tower offered the perfect vantage point for what she had planned, but reaching it would require crossing 60 yards of open ground, where she could be spotted by any of the sentries who were now positioned around the complex.
Elena had studied their patrol patterns for hours, timing their movements down to the second. She waited until the guards rotated positions at exactly 3:15, the moment when their attention would be focused on communicating with each other rather than scanning for threats.
In one fluid movement, she rose from her concealment and sprinted across the open ground, her feet making no sound on the snow-covered earth. Years of training had taught her to move like liquid, flowing from shadow to shadow without creating any disturbance that might alert her enemies.
The bell tower's ancient wooden door was locked, but Elena had prepared for this obstacle days earlier. A small amount of thermite applied to the lock's mechanism had weakened it enough that a single sharp blow was enough to snap it open. She was inside and climbing the stone steps before the guards had finished their rotation. The view from the bell tower's peak confirmed everything Elena had observed from her forest hiding place.
The arms dealers had positioned themselves exactly as she had predicted, with their vehicles arranged in a defensive circle around the main courtyard and guards posted at all the obvious approaches. What they hadn't considered was that their fortress had been compromised from within long before they arrived.
Elena opened her equipment pack and began assembling her rifle, a custom weapon that she had designed specifically for situations like this. 1. The barrel was longer than standard, designed for extreme accuracy at extended ranges. The stock was adjustable for different shooting positions, and the scope was a military-grade optic that could clearly identify targets at distances exceeding half a mile. But the rifle's most important feature was its suppressor, a device that would reduce the sound of each shot to little more than a whisper.
As she made her final preparations, Elena thought about Miguel and the story he had been trying to tell before these men silenced him forever. Her brother had always believed that sunlight was the best disinfectant, that exposing corruption and violence to public scrutiny would eventually make the world a better place.
Elena had chosen a different path, one that involved more direct methods of problem solving. The first shot would be the most important one.
Elena had identified the arms dealer's communications specialist, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who was setting up satellite equipment that would allow the group to coordinate with their international contacts. Without communications, the remaining men would be isolated and unable to call for reinforcements or warn their associates about what was happening.
Elena settled into her shooting position, controlling her breathing as she aligned her crosshairs with the target. The distance was just over 400 yards, well within her comfort zone, but far enough that the sound of her suppressed rifle would be lost in the wind that was now howling through the monastery's ancient stones. The communications specialist never knew what hit him. One moment he was adjusting a satellite dish, and the next he was collapsing into the snow as Elena's bullet found its mark.
The other arms dealers didn't immediately notice that anything was wrong.
Their colleague had simply fallen behind one of the trucks, and in the growing dusk, it would be several minutes before anyone realized he wasn't going to get back up. Elena was already repositioning herself, moving to a different window in the bell tower that offered a clear view of the monastery's western approach. According to her intelligence, these men would attempt to escape using the same route they had taken to arrive, which meant they would have to pass directly through her field of fire. But Elena had underestimated her opponent's experience and paranoia.
Within minutes of the first kill, one of the guards noticed that the communications specialist wasn't responding to radio calls. The alarm was raised immediately, and Elena watched through her scope as the arms dealers transformed from casual criminals into a coordinated military unit.
Dmitry Volkov was shouting orders in Russian, sending men to secure the perimeter, while others began searching the surrounding buildings for threats. Elena realized that her window of opportunity was closing rapidly.
If she wanted to complete her mission, she would have to abandon the bell tower and take the fight to her enemies on their own terms. The game of hunter and hunted was about to begin in earnest, and Elena Vasquez was ready to show these men what it meant to face a predator who had been born in shadows and forged in fire.
The ancient stones of the monastery seemed to absorb sound as Elena descended from the bell tower, each footstep carefully placed to avoid the loose rocks that could give away her position. Below her, she could hear Volkov's men spreading out through the complex, their boots echoing off the walls as they searched for an enemy they couldn't see.
Elena had perhaps 10 minutes before they discovered her hiding place in the tower, and she intended to make every second count. The tunnel entrance she had discovered 3 days earlier was hidden beneath a stone slab in the monastery's old wine cellar.
Getting there would require crossing the main courtyard, where armed men were now positioned behind vehicles and makeshift barriers. Elena had planned for this scenario, but executing her escape under fire would test every skill she had learned during her military service.
She waited until Volkov sent 2 men to search the bell tower, then used their movement as a distraction to slip out through the tower's rear entrance. The monastery's original builders had constructed the complex with multiple levels, and Elena used the elevation changes to her advantage, moving along walls and using architectural features to stay hidden from the searchers below.
A man died without knowing Elena was there. She had spotted him taking position behind a stone pillar near the entrance to the main hall, his attention focused on watching for threats from the forest rather than checking his six. Elena approached from behind, using a combat knife that her brother had given her as a graduation gift from sniper school. The blade slid between his ribs with surgical precision, and Elena lowered his body to the ground before taking his radio and ammunition.
Now she could hear their communications, and what she learned made her blood run cold. These men weren't just arms dealers.
According to the radio chatter, they were expecting additional reinforcements within the next few hours. Apparently, this weapons transfer was part of a much larger operation, and Elena had stumbled into something far more dangerous than she had originally planned for.
But there was something else in their communications that made her pause. One of the men, speaking in accented English, mentioned a journalist who had been asking too many questions about their operation.
Elena's heart pounded as she realized they were talking about Miguel. Her brother was still alive, being held at a location they referred to only as the old facility. This changed everything.
Elena's original mission had been revenge for her brother's presumed death, but now she had hope that Miguel might still be rescued. However, that would only be possible if she could capture one of these men alive and force him to reveal the location where her brother was being held.
Elena made her way toward the wine cellar, moving through shadows and using the monastery's complex architecture to stay hidden from the searchers. She could hear them getting closer, their voices tense as they began to understand that they were dealing with a professional rather than a lucky amateur.
Volkov himself was coordinating the search, his deep voice carrying clearly in the cold air as he deployed his men with military precision. The wine cellar was located in the monastery's basement level, accessed through a narrow stone stairway that was partially hidden behind a collapsed wall. Elena had discovered it during her reconnaissance, noting that the medieval monks had used this space to store not just wine but also valuable items that needed to be protected during times of conflict. More importantly, the cellar connected to the tunnel system that would allow her to move throughout the complex without being detected. As she descended into the darkness below, Elena could hear footsteps above her as the arms dealers continued their search. The stone slab covering the tunnel entrance was heavier than she remembered, requiring several minutes of careful work to move it aside without creating noise that would alert the men above.
Finally, she managed to open the passage and slip into the medieval tunnel system that would become her highway for the next phase of the operation. The tunnels were exactly as she remembered them from her earlier exploration. Narrow passages carved directly into the rock, connecting chambers that had once been used for storage and possibly as hiding places during times of war.
Elena had marked her route with small stones during her previous visits, and she followed these markers now as she made her way toward the tunnel exit that would place her behind the arms dealer's defensive positions.
Above her, she could hear the search intensifying. Volkov's men had found the body of their dead colleague, and their communications had taken on an urgent tone as they realized they were dealing with someone who could kill silently and disappear like smoke.
Elena listened to their radio chatter through the device she had taken, learning valuable information about their positions and their growing desperation. The tunnel exit she had chosen was located inside the monastery's old stable, a building that was now being used to store some of the weapons containers that had been unloaded earlier.
Elena could hear two men inside, speaking in hushed tones as they discussed the best way to defend their position. Perfect. She would need prisoners if she wanted to learn where Miguel was being held. Elena emerged from the tunnel behind a stack of wooden crates, her movements so quiet that the two guards didn't notice her presence until she was already in striking distance. The first man went down silently, knocked unconscious by a precise blow to the base of his skull. The second guard turned just in time to see Elena's rifle pointed at his chest.
"Drop your weapon," Elena whispered in perfect Russian, having learned the language during her military intelligence training. "Make any noise and you'll join your friend on the ground, but he'll be the lucky one."
The guard, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, stared at Elena with wide eyes as he slowly lowered his assault rifle to the floor. She could see him calculating his chances, wondering if he could move fast enough to tackle her before she could fire.
Elena helped him with the math by placing her rifle's barrel against his forehead. "Where is the journalist?" Elena asked, switching to English when she noticed the man's confusion at her Russian.
"The American you've been holding prisoner." "I don't know what you're talking about," the guard replied, but Elena could see the lie in his eyes. She had interrogated enough prisoners during her military service to recognize when someone was hiding information.
"Let me explain something to you," Elena said quietly. "Your friends outside are looking for a ghost.
They think they're dealing with some kind of supernatural threat because I've been able to kill their people and disappear without leaving any traces. But you know the truth.
You can see that I'm just a woman with a rifle and a very specific set of skills. That means you have a choice to make." Elena pressed the rifle barrel harder against the man's forehead, watching his beads of sweat form despite the cold air. "You can tell me where my brother is being held and I'll tie you up and leave you here for the authorities to find tomorrow morning.
Or you can stay silent, and I'll add you to the growing list of people who made the mistake of getting between me and my family."
The guard's resistance crumbled as Elena increased the pressure. He stammered out an address in Bucharest, describing a warehouse district near the old industrial section where Miguel was supposedly being held along with several other prisoners who had gotten too close to the arms-dealing operation.
Elena zip-tied the man's hands and feet, then gagged him with his own belt. She would have preferred to verify his information, but the radio chatter indicated that Volkov's men were getting closer to discovering her escape route.
It was time to move to the next phase of her plan. The weapons storage containers provided excellent cover, as Elena positioned herself for her next series of shots.
She could see three men positioned near the courtyard entrance, their attention focused on watching for threats from outside the monastery complex. They had no idea that their greatest threat was already inside their defensive perimeter, watching them through a rifle scope from less than 50 yards away.
Elena's second kill was a clean headshot that dropped one of the guards instantly. The other two men immediately sought cover, but they made the mistake of bunching together behind the same stone wall.
Elena's third shot punched through the ancient masonry and found its target, while her fourth shot caught the remaining guard as he tried to sprint toward better cover. Now the arms dealers knew they were dealing with a sniper, and Elena could hear the panic in their radio communications as Volkov tried to maintain control of a rapidly deteriorating situation.
Men were shouting conflicting reports about muzzle flashes and firing positions, making it clear that they had no idea where the shots were coming from. Elena used their confusion to relocate once again, this time moving to a position near the monastery's kitchen, where she would have clear lines of sight to multiple escape routes. She was methodically eliminating the arms dealers' ability to coordinate their defense, forcing them to make increasingly desperate decisions that would create new opportunities for her to strike. The fifth man died trying to reach one of the vehicles.
Elena's bullet caught him in the chest as he sprinted across the courtyard, spinning him around before he collapsed into the snow that was now stained red in several places. The remaining men were beginning to panic, their professional composure cracking under the pressure of fighting an enemy they couldn't locate or predict. Through her captured radio, Elena could hear Volkov screaming orders in Russian, demanding that his men spread out and find the shooter. But his commands were having the opposite effect, causing his remaining subordinates to question every shadow and jump at every sound.
Elena had seen this phenomenon before during urban combat operations. Once fear took hold of a unit, it spread like a virus until trained soldiers became amateur gun enthusiasts shooting at phantoms. Elena's military training had taught her that the key to winning an asymmetric engagement was to maintain momentum while denying the enemy any chance to regroup or establish a coordinated response. She had eliminated more than a third of Volkov's force, but the remaining men were still dangerous professionals, who would become increasingly unpredictable as their situation grew more desperate. The radio crackled with a new voice, someone speaking English with what sounded like a South African accent. Elena listened carefully as the man reported that the reinforcements were still 2 hours away, but that helicopter support could be provided within 40 minutes if necessary. This was information that changed her entire tactical situation.
Elena had planned for a quick strike against a small group of arms dealers, but now she was facing the possibility of air support and additional ground forces. If she wanted to complete her mission and rescue Miguel, she would need to finish eliminating the remaining men before the helicopters arrived.
But Volkov was smarter than she had given him credit for. Elena heard him issuing new orders, pulling his remaining men back into defensive positions inside the monastery's main hall where the weapons containers would provide cover and concealment.
He was forcing her to come to them, turning the engagement into exactly the kind of close-quarters battle where Elena's sniper skills would be less effective. The arms dealer had just made his first good tactical decision of the day.
Unfortunately for him, Elena Vasquez had been preparing for this moment her entire professional life, and she was about to show him why close-quarters combat was where legends were born. The main hall of the monastery had once echoed with the chants of medieval monks, but now it resonated with the harsh whispers of men preparing for war. Elena could hear them through the thick stone walls as she positioned herself in the shadows outside the hall's ancient entrance. Volkov had made a tactical retreat, consolidating his remaining 8 men behind the weapons containers that now served as an improvised fortress within the sacred space.
Elena studied the situation through a crack in the wooden doors that had survived centuries but now hung crooked on their iron hinges. The arms dealers had positioned themselves well, using the shipping containers to create overlapping fields of fire that would make any direct assault suicidal. Volkov himself was positioned behind the largest container, a military-grade communications setup spread out before him as he attempted to coordinate with his distant reinforcements.
But Elena had spent 3 days studying this building, and she knew secrets that the arms dealers couldn't possibly have discovered in their brief occupation. The monastery's builders had incorporated defensive features into their architecture, understanding that holy ground often became battlegrounds during times of conflict.
Hidden passages, concealed firing positions, and structural weaknesses that could be exploited by someone who understood medieval engineering. The radio she had taken earlier continued to provide valuable intelligence.
Elena learned that Volkov's reinforcements were indeed 2 hours away, but more concerning was the helicopter that was already airborne and approaching their position. She had perhaps 30 minutes before aerial reconnaissance would make her forest hiding spots useless, forcing her into a purely reactive role that would almost certainly end in her death or capture.
Elena made her decision. The tunnel system she had used to move throughout the complex also connected to a passage that emerged inside the main hall itself. Behind the altar where generations of monks had once conducted their daily prayers.
The entrance was hidden behind a stone panel that appeared to be part of the wall's decorative carving, invisible unless someone knew exactly what to look for. Getting to the tunnel entrance required crossing 50 yards of open ground that was now covered by at least 3 different firing positions. Elena waited until she heard Volkov receiving a radio update about the approaching helicopter, then used the distraction to sprint from shadow to shadow, moving with the fluid grace that had made her one of the military's most effective infiltration specialists. The tunnel entrance was exactly where she remembered it, and Elena slipped into the narrow passage just as searchlights from the arms dealers began sweeping the area where she had been hiding moments before.
The passage was barely wide enough for her shoulders, carved through solid rock by monks who had probably used it to escape during medieval sieges. Elena crawled through the darkness, following the path she had memorized during her earlier reconnaissance. The passage opened behind the altar through a panel that was designed to look like part of the wall's religious decorations. Elena could hear the arms dealers clearly now, their voices tense as they discussed defensive positions and ammunition counts.
They were professional enough to maintain discipline, but she could detect the underlying fear that came from fighting an enemy who seemed to appear and disappear at will. Elena pushed the panel open just enough to observe the scene inside the hall. The weapons containers had been arranged in a rough semicircle, creating protected positions that covered all the obvious approaches. The arms dealers had positioned themselves with military precision, each man responsible for watching a specific sector while maintaining communication with his neighbors.
Volkov was studying a tablet computer that displayed what appeared to be building schematics, probably downloaded from some architectural database.
Elena watched him trace the monastery's layout with his finger, searching for weak points in their defensive position.
He was smarter than she had given him credit for, understanding that any building this old would have secrets that could be exploited by a determined attacker. But Volkov didn't know about the tunnel system, and more importantly, he didn't understand that Elena was no longer playing by the rules of conventional warfare. She had moved beyond military tactics into something more primal, more personal. This was no longer a mission. It was a hunt. And Elena had become the apex predator in an environment where her prey had nowhere left to run.
The first man died without his colleagues even knowing he was under attack. Elena emerged from behind the altar like a shadow given substance, her knife finding the gap between the guard's body armor with surgical precision. She dragged his body behind the altar before anyone noticed he was missing, then used his radio to monitor the arms dealer's communications while she planned her next move. The weapons containers provided excellent cover for the arms dealers, but they also created blind spots that Elena could exploit.
Medieval architects had designed the hall with acoustic properties that allowed sound to carry in specific directions, and Elena used this knowledge to create confusion among her enemies. A pebble thrown against the far wall sounded like footsteps from where Volkov was positioned, causing him to send 2 men to investigate a threat that didn't exist.
Elena killed both men as they passed behind her hiding position, their deaths as silent as the first. Now she had reduced Volkov's force to just 6 men, but the remaining arms dealers were his most experienced operatives. Veterans who wouldn't be fooled by simple distractions or caught off guard by amateur tactics.
The helicopter was getting closer. Elena could hear its rotors echoing off the mountains, and she knew that once it arrived, her tactical advantage would evaporate.
The aircraft would have thermal imaging equipment that could track her movements and probably door gunners who could provide suppressive fire while Volkov's reinforcements moved into position. Elena made her most daring move yet.
Instead of continuing to pick off the arms dealers from hiding, she decided to announce her presence and force them into making mistakes. She stepped out from behind the altar, her rifle trained on Volkov as she called out in clear English.
Dmitry Volkov, former Spetsnaz, dishonorably discharged for selling state secrets.
Currently wanted by Interpol for arms trafficking and murder. You have something that belongs to me. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every weapon in the hall swung toward Elena's position, but none of the men dared to fire while she had their leader in her crosshairs.
Volkov himself stared at Elena with a mixture of surprise and professional respect, recognizing that he was facing someone who had outmaneuvered his entire team. "You're the journalist's sister," Volkov said, his English heavily accented but perfectly clear.
Miguel Vasquez. Yes, we have been expecting you.
Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Expecting me? Of course. Did you think your brother's investigation was accidental? We have been watching your family for months, waiting for the right moment to draw you out.
Miguel was bait, and you took it exactly as we predicted. The implications hit Elena like a physical blow.
This hadn't been a rescue mission or even a revenge operation. It had been a trap designed specifically to lure her into a situation where she could be captured or killed.
The arms-dealing operation was real, but it was also a carefully constructed lure to bring Elena Vasquez into the open. Your reputation preceded you, Volkov continued, his voice calm despite the rifle pointed at his chest.
The American military's most successful female sniper, specializing in impossible shots and deep penetration missions. We knew that if anything happened to your brother, you would come looking for answers.
All we had to do was make sure you found us. Elena's mind raced as she processed this information.
If Volkov was telling the truth, then everything she had observed and planned for was part of a larger deception. The arms dealer's defensive positions, their communication patterns, even their apparent panic at her attacks. It could all have been theater designed to make her overconfident. But Elena had learned long ago not to believe everything her enemies told her, especially when they were trying to buy time while reinforcements approached. She could hear the helicopter getting closer, and she noticed that Volkov's men were subtly adjusting their positions while their leader kept her talking.
"Where is my brother?" Elena asked, maintaining her aim despite the growing certainty that she was walking into an even deeper trap. "Safe. For now. But his continued well-being depends entirely on your cooperation. Surrender your weapons, and we can discuss terms for his release."
Elena almost laughed at the suggestion. She had studied Volkov's history extensively, and she knew that he had never released a prisoner alive in his entire criminal career.
Miguel was probably already dead, and even if he wasn't, surrendering would simply mean that Elena would join him in whatever unmarked grave Volkov had prepared. But the conversation had given Elena valuable information. She now knew that this entire operation was more complex than she had originally understood. involving resources and planning that suggested a much larger organization than a simple arms-dealing network. The question was whether she could survive long enough to uncover the truth and potentially rescue her brother.
The helicopter sound was now directly overhead, and Elena could see the arms dealers preparing to make their move. Volkov's men were professionals who had been given time to position themselves, while their leader distracted their target with conversation. In a few seconds, the aircraft would provide additional firepower, and Elena would be facing impossible odds. But Elena Vasquez had built her reputation by accomplishing impossible missions, and she had no intention of disappointing her enemies now.
As the helicopter's searchlight began probing through the monastery's windows, Elena smiled at Volkov with the cold confidence of a predator who had just decided to stop playing with her prey.
"Tell me, Dmitri," Elena said as she began to move, flowing like liquid from one position to another while maintaining perfect aim. "Have you ever seen what happens when someone brings a helicopter to a knife fight?" The ancient monastery was about to become the stage for a battle that would redefine the meaning of impossible odds, and Elena Vasquez was ready to show the world why legends were born in moments when everything seemed lost but victory was still within reach for someone willing to pay any price to achieve it. The helicopter's searchlight carved through the monastery's ancient windows like a sword of pure white fire, transforming the sacred hall into a theater of war where shadows danced with deadly intent. Elena moved the instant the light hit the walls, her body flowing through the geometric patterns of cover and concealment that she had memorized during her reconnaissance.
The arms dealers opened fire simultaneously, their muzzle flashes creating a strobing light show that would have been beautiful if it hadn't been designed to kill her. But Elena was no longer where their weapons were aimed. Years of training had taught her to think 3 moves ahead, to anticipate not just where her enemies would shoot but where they would expect her to be when they pulled their triggers. She rolled behind a stone pillar as bullets sparked off the ancient masonry, each impact sending chips of medieval craftsmanship flying through the air like deadly confetti. The helicopter pilot was good, adjusting his position to keep the searchlight on Elena's last known location while his door gunner prepared to provide suppressive fire. But the aircraft's presence also meant that Elena could no longer rely on stealth and precision.
This was about to become the kind of chaotic firefight where survival depended on pure skill, battlefield instincts, and a willingness to take risks that would make sane people question her mental state. Elena had brought more than just her sniper rifle to the monastery.
Hidden in her equipment pack were items that most people would consider excessive for a single person facing multiple armed opponents. But Elena had learned during her military service that there was no such thing as excessive firepower when lives were on the line, especially when one of those lives belonged to someone she loved.
The first explosive device was a small breaching charge that Elena had originally intended to use for opening locked doors during her infiltration. Now she armed it and threw it toward the weapons containers where 3 of Volkov's men had taken cover. The explosion wasn't large enough to kill anyone behind adequate protection, but it was more than sufficient to destroy the communications equipment that Volkov had been using to coordinate with his reinforcements. The blast also created a cloud of dust and debris that momentarily blocked the helicopter's searchlight, giving Elena the cover she needed to change positions once again. She sprinted across the hall toward a section where medieval builders had incorporated defensive features that most modern observers would mistake for purely decorative elements. The monastery's original architects had understood siege warfare, and they had designed their buildings to be defended by small groups against larger attacking forces. Hidden firing ports, concealed passages, and structural features that could channel attackers into killing zones where defenders would have overwhelming advantages. Elena had studied these features during her reconnaissance, and now she was about to turn medieval engineering into modern battlefield tactics. Volkov was shouting orders in Russian, trying to coordinate his men's movements while the helicopter pilot struggled to reposition his aircraft for a clear shot. The arms dealer was proving to be exactly as competent as Elena had expected, adapting quickly to changing circumstances and maintaining discipline among his subordinates even as their situation deteriorated. Elena's second explosive device was a fragmentation grenade that she had modified with additional shrapnel designed to be particularly effective against unarmored targets. She cooked it for exactly 3 seconds before throwing it into the middle of Volkov's defensive position, forcing his men to scatter and abandon the coordinated fields of fire they had established. The explosion caught one man in the open, and Elena's rifle took him down before he could reach new cover. That left Volkov with just 4 subordinates, but they were his most experienced operatives. Men who had survived countless dangerous situations by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than their opponents. The helicopter pilot was getting frustrated. Elena could tell from the way the aircraft was moving in increasingly aggressive patterns as the door gunner searched for a clear shot. The monastery's ancient architecture was actually working in Elena's favor, creating visual barriers and acoustic shadows that made it difficult for aerial surveillance to track her movements effectively.
But Elena knew that her defensive advantages were temporary. The helicopter carried enough firepower to eventually reduce the entire monastery to rubble, and Volkov's ground reinforcements were still approaching.
She needed to end this engagement quickly, before overwhelming force made victory impossible. Elena activated her most dangerous gambit.
During her reconnaissance, she had discovered that the monastery's heating system was fed by natural gas pipes that ran throughout the building.
The medieval monks couldn't have anticipated this modern addition, but Elena had spent considerable time studying the pipe layout and identifying critical junction points where a small explosion could create much larger secondary effects. The shaped charge she had planted 3 days earlier was positioned against a main gas feed that supplied the entire complex.
Elena had originally intended it as a last resort escape mechanism, but now she armed it remotely while calculating blast patterns and structural damage that would affect her enemies more than herself. Volkov seemed to sense that something had changed.
Elena watched him through her scope as he gestured frantically to his remaining men, probably ordering them to pull back from positions that his tactical instincts told him were about to become untenable. The arms dealer's survival instincts had kept him alive through decades of dangerous operations, and those same instincts were now screaming warnings about Elena's next move. The gas explosion began as a rumble felt through the monastery stone foundations, then erupted into a fireball that consumed the entire eastern section of the building. The blast wave knocked Volkov's men to the ground and created enough smoke and debris to completely obscure the helicopter pilot's vision. More importantly, the explosion severed several load-bearing supports that caused part of the roof to collapse directly onto the weapons containers. Elena used the chaos to close distance with her remaining opponents, switching from her sniper rifle to the assault weapon she had taken from one of the dead guards. Close-quarters combat was not her preferred engagement type, but years of military training had made her competent with every weapon system she might encounter in the field. The first man she encountered was stumbling through the smoke. Temporarily blinded by dust and disoriented by the explosion, Elena's burst caught him center mass before he even realized she was there. The second man was more alert, spinning toward her muzzle flash with professional speed, but Elena had already changed positions and her return fire dropped him before he could acquire a target.
That left Volkov and 2 subordinates, but Elena could hear them coordinating their movements through the smoke, using hand signals and predetermined rally points to re-establish their defensive formation. These men were proving to be exactly as dangerous as their reputations suggested, adapting to changing circumstances with the kind of tactical flexibility that separated professionals from amateurs.
The helicopter pilot had managed to get his aircraft clear of the smoke, and Elena could see the searchlight probing through the haze as the door gunner prepared to resume firing. She needed to eliminate that aerial threat before it could provide support to Volkov's remaining ground forces.
Elena had saved her most ambitious plan for last. The monastery's bell tower, partially damaged by the gas explosion, was now structurally compromised but still standing. More importantly, it was tall enough that someone positioned at its peak could engage aerial targets with direct fire. The challenge was reaching the tower while avoiding 3 experienced killers and a helicopter equipped with military-grade weapons.
Elena's solution involved using the tunnel system one more time, but not in the way her enemies would expect. Instead of trying to move covertly through the passages, she began making noise deliberately, drawing Volkov's men toward tunnel entrances where they would be vulnerable to the trap she had prepared during her initial reconnaissance. The first trap was a simple fragmentation device positioned at a tunnel junction where approaching footsteps would trigger a pressure switch. Elena heard the explosion and the subsequent screams, indicating that at least one of Volkov's men had taken the bait. The second trap was more sophisticated, using a tripwire to trigger a shaped charge that would collapse a section of tunnel on anyone attempting to pursue her through the underground passages. Now Elena could hear Volkov himself calling out to her, his voice carrying clearly through the smoke and debris that filled the monastery hall. Elena Vasquez, we can still negotiate terms for your brother's release. You have proven your capabilities, but this ends now before more blood is shed unnecessarily. Elena almost laughed at the suggestion. She had studied Volkov's psychological profile extensively, and she knew that he was buying time while his remaining subordinate moved into position for a flanking attack. The arms dealer was stalling, using conversation to distract Elena while he maneuvered for a killing shot. But Elena had been expecting this tactic. Through her scope, she could see the muzzle flash suppressor on a rifle barrel protruding from behind a collapsed section of wall where Volkov's last remaining subordinate had taken position. The man was good, patient and disciplined enough to wait for the perfect shot. But he had made the mistake of choosing a hiding place that Elena had already identified during her reconnaissance. Elena's shot took him through the gap between 2 stones, a nearly impossible target that required precision calculation of bullet trajectory and deflection angles. The man died instantly, his rifle clattering to the floor as Elena eliminated Volkov's last remaining support.
Now it was just Elena and Dmitry Volkov, alone in the ruins of a medieval monastery, while a helicopter circled overhead like a mechanical vulture, waiting for the final confrontation to begin.
Elena had eliminated 7 professional killers and survived odds that should have been mathematically impossible. But she was about to face her most dangerous opponent yet. Volkov had built his reputation by being smarter, more ruthless, and more prepared than everyone else in his profession. He had survived situations that had killed lesser men, and he had done so by understanding that the only rule in warfare was that there were no rules when survival was at stake. Elena checked her ammunition count and prepared for the final phase of an engagement that had already become the defining moment of her professional life. In a few minutes, one of them would be dead, and Elena intended to make sure it wasn't going to be her. Silence fell over the monastery like a burial shroud, broken only by the distant sound of helicopter rotors and the crackle of fires burning among the debris. Elena moved through the smoke with predatory patience, her senses hyper-tuned to detect any sign of movement from her final opponent. Dmitry Volkov had gone quiet, which meant he was either planning something elaborate or positioning himself for a desperate last stand. Elena had faced many dangerous opponents during her military career, but none quite like Volkov. The man's psychological profile indicated someone who thrived under pressure, who became more dangerous as situations grew more desperate. His Spetsnaz training had taught him to turn disadvantages into weapons, and his criminal career had reinforced those lessons through brutal, real-world experience. The helicopter pilot was still circling overhead, but Elena could tell from the aircraft's movement patterns that he was running low on fuel.
The searchlight sweeps were becoming less frequent and more focused, indicating that the crew was conserving resources while waiting for ground reinforcements that were still at least 90 minutes away. Elena had a narrow window of opportunity to finish this engagement before overwhelming force arrived to tip the scales permanently against her. Through the smoke and debris, Elena caught a glimpse of movement near the altar where this entire confrontation had begun.
Volkov was using the same concealment techniques that Elena had employed earlier, moving through architectural shadows and using the monastery's ancient features to mask his approach. He was good, professional enough to remain invisible even to someone with Elena's training and experience. But Elena had one crucial advantage that Volkov couldn't have anticipated. She knew this building better than he did, having spent 3 days studying every stone and memorizing every sightline.
When Volkov moved behind the altar, Elena was already positioned to intercept him, her rifle trained on the exact spot where he would have to emerge if he wanted a clear shot at her previous position. The 2 professionals saw each other at exactly the same moment, their weapons swinging toward their respective targets with mechanical precision. This was the moment that separated legends from statistics, when years of training and natural talent would be tested in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Elena's shot was perfect, a center mass hit that should have ended the confrontation immediately. But Volkov was wearing body armor that she hadn't accounted for, military-grade protection that absorbed the bullet's impact and kept him in the fight. His return shot missed Elena by inches as she dove behind a collapsed section of stone wall, the bullets sparking off medieval masonry that had probably deflected arrows during siege warfare centuries earlier. Now Elena understood why Volkov had survived so many dangerous situations. The man was prepared for everything, equipped with gear and backup plans that covered every possible contingency.
His body armor wasn't just protection. It was a statement that he never entered a conflict without planning to walk away alive. Elena's second shot took Volkov in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop his primary weapon.
But instead of falling or seeking cover, he rolled toward Elena's position while drawing a sidearm with his uninjured hand. The man was proving to be exactly as dangerous wounded as he had been at full strength, maybe more so because desperation was making him unpredictable.
The pistol fight that followed was unlike anything Elena had experienced during her military service. Both combatants moved through the monastery ruins with fluid precision, using rubble and architectural features for cover, while seeking that perfect shot that would end the engagement.
Elena's training gave her technical advantages, but Volkov's desperation and criminal cunning made him equally formidable. Elena's third shot shattered the stone inches from Volkov's head, sending fragments flying as he returned fire with mechanical precision. His bullet passed so close to Elena's ear that she could feel the heat from its passage, a reminder that margins for error had been reduced to virtually nothing. But the extended gunfight was providing Elena with valuable intelligence about her opponent's capabilities and limitations.
Volkov was favoring his wounded shoulder, which meant his accuracy would deteriorate with each shot fired. More importantly, he was running low on ammunition, which explained why his return fire was becoming less frequent and more carefully aimed.
Elena decided to force the issue. Instead of continuing the long-range pistol duel, she began closing distance with her opponent. using aggressive movement to deny him time for careful shot placement. This was a calculated risk that could easily result in her death. But Elena understood that sometimes victory required accepting acceptable levels of danger to achieve decisive results. Volkov seemed surprised by Elena's tactical shift, probably expecting her to maintain distance where her sniper training would provide maximum advantage. But Elena had learned urban combat techniques that emphasized aggression and momentum over patient precision, skills that were perfectly suited for close-quarters confrontations in confined spaces. The final exchange occurred at a range of less than 10 feet, with both combatants firing simultaneously while moving at full sprint toward positions that would either provide decisive advantage or expose them to immediate death.
Elena's shot took Volkov's center mass, while his bullet passed harmlessly over her head, as the shoulder wound affected his aim at the crucial moment. Dmitry Volkov fell backward against the monastery's ancient altar, his life leaking away onto stones that had witnessed centuries of violence and redemption.
Elena approached cautiously, her weapon still trained on him, but she could see that the threat was neutralized. The arms dealer's eyes were already losing focus as he struggled to form final words.
"Your brother?" Volkov gasped, blood speckling his lips as he spoke.
"Still alive."
Warehouse District, Building 743.
Elena knelt beside him, maintaining weapon discipline, even as she strained to hear information that could save Miguel's life. How many guards? What kind of security? But Volkov's eyes had already gone blank, carrying their secrets into whatever afterlife awaited men who had built their fortunes on others' suffering. Elena checked for a pulse out of professional habit, then began searching his body for additional intelligence that might help her locate and rescue her brother.
The helicopter had finally departed, probably returning to base for refueling before the pilot attempted any rescue operations. Elena could hear vehicles approaching through the forest, but they were still several minutes away from reaching the monastery.
She had a brief window of opportunity to gather intelligence and escape before Volkov's reinforcements arrived to complicate her situation. Elena found what she was looking for in Volkov's jacket pocket, a satellite phone containing contact numbers and recent messages that provided valuable insight into the arms-dealing network's structure and operations.
More importantly, she discovered GPS coordinates for the warehouse location where Miguel was supposedly being held, along with security codes that might allow her to approach without immediately triggering whatever defensive measures were in place. But as Elena prepared to leave the monastery and begin the next phase of her mission, she discovered something that changed everything she thought she understood about the situation. Among Volkov's possessions was a photograph of Miguel, but he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a woman Elena recognized from intelligence briefings, someone who was supposed to be dead according to official records.
Maria Santos had been Elena's partner during some of the most dangerous missions of her military career, a fellow sniper whose skills had been legendary even among elite special operations units. But Maria had supposedly died in Afghanistan 3 years earlier, killed during a mission that had gone catastrophically wrong. Elena had attended her funeral and spoken at a memorial service for someone she had considered both a colleague and a friend. Now Elena was looking at photographic evidence that Maria Santos was not only alive but apparently involved with the same criminal network that was holding Miguel prisoner.
The implications were staggering and suggested a level of deception that reached far beyond simple arms dealing into something that threatened everything Elena thought she knew about her past. The approaching vehicles were getting closer, their engines echoing off the monastery walls as Elena made her final preparations to leave the scene. She had eliminated 7 dangerous criminals and survived a confrontation that should have been mathematically impossible, but she was beginning to understand that this had been only the opening move in a much larger and more complex game. Elena gathered her equipment and made her way back to the tunnel system that would allow her to escape into the forest before Volkov's reinforcements could establish a perimeter around the monastery. As she disappeared into the medieval passages that had provided sanctuary to hunted men for centuries, she carried with her the knowledge that saving Miguel would require confronting betrayals and deceptions that went far deeper than anything she had originally imagined. The ghost had claimed her victories and vanished into legend, but Elena Vasquez understood that her real war was just beginning. Somewhere in the warehouse district of Bucharest, her brother was waiting for rescue, guarded by people who might include someone Elena had once trusted with her life. The next phase of her mission would test not just her tactical skills, but her ability to distinguish between enemies and allies, when the difference could determine who lived and who died.
Elena emerged from the monastery's ruins as sirens began wailing in the distance. Emergency responders finally alerted to the violence that had transformed a sacred site into a battlefield. She disappeared into the Romanian wilderness like smoke dispersing in the wind, carrying with her the memory of 7 men who had underestimated what happened when someone threatened family.
Behind her, the ancient monastery stood silhouetted against the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, its stones bearing witness to another chapter in the eternal story of those who hunt and those who are hunted. The building would be investigated, documented, and eventually forgotten by everyone except those who understood that some legends were born not in myths, but in the terrible mathematics of survival when everything precious hung in the balance.
Elena Vasquez had become exactly what her enemies had feared, a ghost who could kill with precision and disappear without a trace. But as she made her way toward Bucharest and the final confrontation that awaited her there, she carried the knowledge that ghosts could be betrayed just as easily as living people, and that the deadliest enemies were sometimes those who knew exactly how to make legends bleed.
7 enemy snipers, 1 woman. And she vanished before they knew what hit them.